I'm Aaron, and this is Keep Painting Minis, the YouTube channel where we keep painting minis. And today we will paint the Kosargi Nightguard from the Cursed City box set. We're going to base coat with some contrast paints and then use some regular acrylic paints to shade and highlight. So join me back here in just a second and we'll get started. To give us the bright primer color that we need for our contrast paints, I used the white Stynylrez with a drop of the tan shot through the airbrush, and that gives us this bright white but slightly warm primer color. We're starting with the leather boots and the leather cuffs, and for leather, one of my favorite colors is the contrast gore grunta fur. Sometimes it's just one coat does it all, as you'll see here. Sometimes I'll go back and shade and highlight, but as you'll see, this gore grunta fur often takes care of everything, and if it's not a part of the model you want to emphasize, often you really don't need to do anything more than one coat of the gore grunta. Now I'm doing my best to avoid the contrast paint splotches, but they can really never be completely avoided, and that's okay, because you'll see part of my process is what I call the contrast paint splotch fix-up step, which you'll see later in the process for all of our contrast layers that we put down on some of the larger smooth surfaces. And here's what the leather boots and the leather cuffs look like so far. Next, we're coming in with the contrast paint Flesh Terror Red for the pants, the trousers. So you'll see that I wanted to keep my main color palette to the reds and the browns. I chose the Flesh Terror's red here with contrast in mind, meaning that this Flesh Terror red is sort of on the cooler side. It's got a little purple to it compared to what I'll come in for the coat with the warmer, more orangey Blood Angels red. And now I'll come in with the contrast Blood Angels red for the base layer of the overcoat. Notice how I try to keep my brush as much as possible on the surface and try not to overlap. Minimizing the splotchiness on large flat surfaces with contrast paints is really a practiced skill. And one technique I found is if you keep the brush on the surface rather than on and off and on and off, and you avoid overlaps, that will improve the finish and avoid to some extent the contrast splotchiness. And now I'm coming in with contrast skeleton horde to base coat the fur. And as you'll see, I'm not terribly happy with how this fur goes, and I try a few different things throughout the painting process here. Ultimately, I'm happy with the result, but it took a lot of experimentation. You see, I think part of the thing with the fur on this model is I think the fur strands are sort of over sculpted and exaggerated, and you'll see here when all I have is the skeleton horde down, it looks like he's wearing a head full of worms, and I sort of obscure that with other things later in the process, as you'll see, and ultimately I'm happy with it. Now I'm going in with the contrast wildwood for the handle, the shaft on the axe. I love wildwood. Again, one of those brown colors in the contrast line that if you're not looking to emphasize this part of the model, it can be just one coat, and you've got great shadows, decent midtones, and decent highlights all in one. And now back to fussing with the fur hat with some ivory for the fur strands. You'll see that there's some red that I put in there. That was Flesh Terror red watered down. I thought, let me give it a little bit of color and interest. And so I did use a little Flesh Terror red, and now I'm coming in with the ivory to highlight the individual strands, but I think that just exaggerated this appearance, sort of this overly sculpted head full of worms appearance. And so you'll see that I try one or two other things later in the process. Now we're coming in with the Pro Acryl Black Brown. Love this line of paints, traditional acrylics, for the soles of the boots. I just wanted them to be a little bit different color than the, what do we call that, the uppers? So this is a terrific color, this Pro Acryl Black Brown. Great coverage, one coat does it. Now I'm going to mix some Pro Acryl Burnt Red with their dark purple to a glaze consistency, as you see there on my thumb, to reinforce the shadows in the recesses on the pants. And as you'll see throughout the process, I like to work with glaze consistencies. It takes a few more steps, but you don't get those stark stripes and transitions. You get smoother transitions. So if you get used to that approach, it won't slow you down much, and you might be happier with the results. I know I am. And now for highlights on the pants, I am going to mix some bright red, the Bold Pyrrole red, and the pale yellow from Monument Hobbies Pro Acryl line with some glaze medium, glaze consistency. And I'm finding the upper parts of the surfaces, the tops of the folds and so forth, building it up slowly, letting the first layer dry before applying the next, but doesn't take very long because these are very thin glazed consistency coats, until you get the visual contrast from the highlights that you're happy with. And next we're going to come in with the contrast splotch repair step that I talked about. And my process here is to find the mid-tone of the color I'm interested in, glaze it down very thinly, and just apply successive coats which will sort of bring a consistency to the finish. The highlights and the shadows that we got from the contrast will still be there, but this thin glaze will tend to smooth out the splotchiness and bring back some consistency and add to the color saturation as well. It's not too hard to do. Nice thin coat. You really can't make mistakes. Go around and around a few layers of this until you're happy with it. You haven't eliminated in any substantial way the shadows and the highlights, but you've smoothed out the splotchiness. And now you can leave it at that. You've got a whole army to paint. You want to get them on the tabletop and it still looks great. Or you can take it a little further and reinforce the shadows and reinforce the highlights. In this case, I'm going to reinforce the shadows with a glazed down mix of the Pro Acryl Burnt Red and Mahogany. And I'm going to find those recesses and just make a few laps around the model. By the time I get around again, the first layer will be dry, and just till I'm happy with a little bit of more contrast I've created by reinforcing the shadows. And now I'm going to reinforce the highlights with a warm highlight, which is a mix of this bright red from Pro Acryl with the orange at a glazed consistency. And again, I mentioned before, I want the coat to have a nice warm red to it, which contrasts with the pants, which were a cool red. And so that's why I'm highlighting, getting almost up to a true orange. Again, glaze consistency, make your laps around the model. The nice thing about the glaze is it's hard to break anything. And you just need to be a little patient and just make your way around the model as many times as you want until you're happy with the contrast that you can see. And now I'm going to take another run at the fur hat by shading it down with this recently released color, depending upon when you're watching this video, from Citadel, the Soul Bright Gray, and I love the fact that they offer us a gray now. And I just thought that maybe this would soften the look of those individual strands. And you'll see that I think it does start to take the fur hat in the right direction, and I'll come after it again with another step later in the process. But I definitely think this was a step in the right direction. Next we're coming in with one of my favorite metallics, the dark aluminum from the Vallejo metal color line. Now this is an airbrush color, so it's quite liquid, quite flowy. And so, but I brush it on all the time. You just have to make sure that there isn't a lot on your brush, and then you can control it fairly well. And so for this model, the silver metallics were for the axe head and the helmet that is at the top of his fur hat. I painted the helmet off camera. And now one last touch up for that fur hat. That is the Pro Acryl Bright Neutral Gray, which I'm going to dry brush. I have this flat tip brush which is very helpful for dry brushing small textured features like this. And as always with dry brush, you'll put some on your brush, you'll wipe off almost all of the paint on something like a kitchen towel, and then you will gently brush the bristles against the grain of the texture and go around and around until you're happy with how much paint you've left on there. And I think finally this last dry brushing step did push back how much those individual strands stand out, and so now I'm happy with how that fur hat's looking. And now I'm coming in with the Citadel Nuln Oil shade to shade down the silver axe head to develop some depth and contrast. And you can see that actually the shade ended up a little splotchy on the back. But I'm going to do some more weathering on the axe head, and so that's not going to be an issue at all. There's always a way to fix a mistake. A mistake can equally be viewed as a feature. So now I'm going in with Seraphim Sepia to weather the axe head. I'm just sort of imagining where some sort of worn and rusty areas on the axe head would be, and mixing it up sort of at random, giving it a natural organic feel, thinking about where water might settle, which leads to rust. And you'll see the next step is to come in with some orange shade to enhance the rust look on the portions of the axe head that are pitted. So now to push the rust look a little further, I'm coming in with the Citadel shade Fuegan Orange, and I am hitting just these areas on the axe head that look like pits, where the metal has presumably been rusted away. And I always found this Fuegan Orange to be sort of a real quick and convenient but effective way to add a rust appearance to a silver metallic. And now I'm going to edge highlight the axe head on the edges and also on those center lines. And I do something unusual. I like to use this ivory traditional acrylic paint rather than a brighter metallic to edge highlight my silver metallics. And you can go either way. Some people are of the opinion that this stands out a little too much, but I find that just using a brighter metallic, depending on the lighting in the room, oftentimes I sort of can't even see the edge highlighting if you're just using a brighter metallic. And so I like to use this ivory. It's not a white, it's an ivory. And I try to keep it as thin as possible. You've got to have your silver at the ready if you've painted a line that's too thick. And especially from a tabletop distance, I really like this look over a brighter metallic. And now it's time to do the contrast paint splotch repair step with the brown cuffs. The brown cuffs were quite splotchy, if you recall from the earlier step when we hit them with the gore grunt of fur. And you see it's just a little too splotchy, so I'm coming in with this very thin glaze of those two colors, the grip tan red and the ruddy brown mixed together. Again, what I was after is sort of a mid-tone that's appropriate for the color I'd already laid down. And I just apply very thin layers until I think that I've sort of visually smoothed out. And you can see there, the splotchiness is sort of blended in much better now and doesn't jump out at you. And then when we go in with the edge highlighting, it ends up looking pretty terrific in my opinion. And now I'm coming in to highlight that brown with Griffin Tan again, mixed with a lighter color this time, this Desert Tan, and glazing it down, and that's going to be my edge highlight color for those cuffs. And so here I wanted to show you the difference between the highlighted cuff and the one that I haven't highlighted yet, and just to show off how effective that highlight is. And here are both cuffs highlighted, and since I was careful about color matching, I think the highlight looks like a little more blended and a little less stripy than it otherwise would, because it's close in color to the mid-tone. Now I'm coming in with the golden brown from Pro Acryl as an undercoat for this shoulder feature that I'm going to be painting gold. So gold is going to cover better over this golden brown. You can use a dark brown. It's always helpful to undercoat a feature with a brownish color before you go in with your gold, because the gold metallics often don't cover that well. I do like this rich gold from Pro Acryl. It does cover pretty well. And so here I'm applying the gold, and then I'll wash it down, and then I'll highlight it as you'll see in the next few steps. And now I'm going to come in with Citadel's Reichland Flesh shade, which has a little bit of a red to it, to shade down the gold I just applied to that shoulder feature. And we'll let that dry, and then we'll highlight it up. And now I'll come in with a silver metallic from Pro Acryl to highlight the gold. And when it comes to a gold metallic, I do like using a metallic as the highlight as opposed to the ivory I used on the silver, and that's because you can visually see it distinctly under any light, the silver on top of the gold. And so I do highlight my golds with silver color, and I'll also hit those rivets, and just looking for the edges and the surfaces that I think ought to be highlighted. And now coming back with my favorite contrast for leather bits, the Gore Grunt of Fur for the leather straps on his overcoat and his large belt. And again, as far as contrast paint application techniques go, loading up the brush and trying to use as few brush strokes as possible, and trying to avoid overlapping brush strokes and let the contrast paint just wick off of the end of the brush. And that's how we're looking now with the straps and belt covered with the Gorgrunta. Now we're coming in with Pro Acryl Copper for the belt buckle, and as you'll see, I do like the copper, but it really doesn't stand out, and so I'll come in another step and get the border of that copper belt with the silver metallic for a little visual contrast, which you'll see in a minute. Getting all the little buttons also with the Pro Acryl Copper. And here, this is just to show you that I went in with a silver metallic for the edge of that copper buckle, just so that it could stand out visually. Now we're coming in with the Soul Bright Gray. Again, I'm so pleased with Citadel coming out with this gray shade, because it's perfect for shading white hair, heavily stranded white hair, for example. And so that's what I've done with the beard here. And then I'm coming in with the edge of my brush and some bright white to get the tops of those strands, to bring them back up from a highlight perspective so that they contrast with that shade I just added. And I'm pretty happy with how that came out. Coming in with the Pro Acryl Olive Flesh for the base coat of his flesh, which I will then make even more stickly with a recipe including shade and contrast paint. But I wanted to lay down this base coat so that I am not tinting the bright white primer coat in the next step. And now to create the sickly grayish green color I wanted for his skin, I mixed a recipe of 5 drops of contrast medium with 5 drops of the Soul Bright Gray shade with 1 drop of this Gut Rip of Flesh. It's a strong color. And I got a nice thin wash / contrast paint that gave me the color I was looking for his skin. Now just coming back in with the olive flesh to bring back some of the highlights on that skin surface. And then I'll do even more with his face, as you'll see in a few more steps. Now coming in with the Pro Acryl Magenta for his gums. And this is usually my go-to for gums, but I needed him to look a little more sickly and worn, and so what I didn't show, what I did off camera, is that is the magenta washed with Agrax Earthshade, because this guy needs to look like he doesn't brush his teeth very often. And now I'm putting these 2 colors on my palette with a glaze consistency to work with to add shadows and highlights to his face, to give his face a little more attention. Here you'll see I'm adding the shadows in some creases above the lip and below the nose, and I did the rest off camera. Now I'm coming in with this rusty red, glaze consistency again, to get after the parts of this model that where the skin is missing. So his hands and his eye sockets, and this cool open wound on his back where his ribs are showing. And then on that back wound and his hands where the bones show, I went in with some ivory to reestablish the bones. And now as a final touch, I'm going in with Agrax Earthshade to dirty up his fingernails, just working my way around the fingernails, dabbing that stuff on, moving it around a little bit so that it looks all dirty and gnarly. And with that final step, we're now ready to have a look at the close-up montage reveal. Stagehand, the velour curtain please, and reveal. I hope you enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed painting. I can't thank you enough for coming to the channel and coming back to the channel. Please do help out the channel by hitting that like button and subscribing, as you know it's free and it really does help. I upload 2 to 3 new videos each month, so also be sure to hit that bell button so you'll be alerted to the new content. And please do connect with me through the comments, and I can't wait to see you back here again soon. Most importantly, keep painting minis.